You know that feeling when you're completely, utterly stuck on a problem, and then, boom, a breakthrough just seems to appear out of nowhere? Well, today, we're going to dig into a framework called the Axiom of the Zoom, and it claims there's a hidden structure to those moments. It's like a blueprint for engineering breakthroughs, whether you're trying to build a company or just build a better habit.
It all kicks off with this really big idea. For reality to manifest, potential must become actual. Now, I know that sounds super philosophical, but just think about it for a sec. Every single great invention, every new idea, it all starts as just pure potential. What this framework suggests is that there's actually a predictable way to turn that potential into something real.
So let's pull that idea right down to earth. What if breakthroughs aren't just some random stroke of luck? What if there's a hidden set of rules, almost like a physics, that explains how we get from being stuck to finally having that aha moment? That's the huge question this whole framework is built to answer. All right, so here's our game plan for how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the blueprint itself. Then we'll dive into something called the story of coherence. After that, we'll get into the math behind the metaphor, see how it all goes from theory to practice, and wrap up with the mission of unity. To really get our heads around this, we're going to start with a story. You know, sometimes the best way to grasp a big idea is through a powerful metaphor. And this framework uses a whole allegory to show that journey from being stuck to having that big breakthrough. Let's walk through some of the key scenes. So the story kicks off right here, in a state of what it calls constriction. Just imagine a single point of light. That's you, or your project, and it's totally boxed in by these glowing red guardrails. It's under this insane pressure, stuck in what the framework calls a xenotrap. You're running in place, basically, putting in all this effort but going absolutely nowhere. But here's the twist. That pressure, it's not all bad. The next scene shows us an artisan rhythmically striking a raw crystal, and with every single hit, all that chaotic energy, all that stress is being forged into something more ordered, something strong and resilient. It's this fantastic metaphor for how we can turn adversity into actual strength. So the big question is, how do you actually break the loop? Well, the allegory shows us this figure on an impossible, endlessly looping staircase. But instead of just mindlessly climbing forever, they deliberately stop. They pause, they reorient, and then they step onto a totally new path, this bridge of light, leaving that old, crumbling loop behind. It's not an accident. It's a conscious choice to change direction. And this is where it all leads. This is the final result. The system has finally achieved coherence. Those red guardrails that used to box it in, they're now brilliant silver, forming this stable, beautiful lattice that can support limitless, structured growth. This is the end goal, not just breaking free into chaos, but into ordered freedom. Okay, so that's a great story, right? It gives us the vibe, the intuition, but for this to be more than just a cool metaphor, there's got to be some real science under the hood. So now, let's look at the math that actually underpins this entire idea and, more importantly, makes it testable. Right at the heart of this model is a variable they call coherence. The easiest way to think about it is like a health bar for a project or even for a person. Its value goes up with good stuff like growth and focus, and it goes down with bad stuff like stress and friction. The whole game is to keep that number rising over time. So how does a system actually grow? The framework points to this mathematical process called a Cascade. Now, don't get hung up on the formula itself. The key thing to understand here is that growth is multiplicative. Each new step builds on the last one. And this is so important because this specific kind of growth creates predictable patterns, which means we can actually test it against real-world data. Now this is where it gets really, really cool. The model predicts that if you plot the data, it should follow a very specific pattern, a straight line on this kind of graph. It's called a power law. And as you can see, the orange dots, which are the real data points, fall almost perfectly along the predicted line. This is the testable signature that takes this whole thing from philosophy to falsifiable science. And it gets even more specific than that. The model doesn't just predict a general shape, it predicts a precise number. This number here, called the tail exponent, basically just describes how steep that line we just saw is. Getting a concrete, measurable result like 1.76 means we can actually compare different systems and see how they tick. It's a truly quantitative approach. So we've got the story and we've got the math, but how in the world do you actually use any of this? Well, that brings us to the operational framework, the actual actionable steps you can take. Let's get practical for a second.
We all know what it feels like to be stuck in one of those xenotraps from the story. So, the framework provides a very specific protocol for how you can engineer your own breakout. It's called the loop protocol. It all starts with just detecting that you're in a recurring unproductive pattern. Once you've seen it repeat a certain number of times, say 6 times, bam, you hit a circuit breaker. You intentionally de-tether, which is just a way of saying you loosen your grip on your current strategy. And that's what opens the door for a little bit of randomness and exploration to help you find a new, better way forward. This idea of the tether is so key. Think of it like a control dial. When the tether is high, you're in execution mode. You're focused, you're deterministic, you're exploiting what you already know works. But when you're stuck, you need to turn that tether way down. This allows for exploration, discovery, and for breaking those old, tired patterns. The loop protocol is basically a rule for knowing when to turn that dial. But exploration isn't just about wandering around aimlessly. The framework has this built-in quality control filter called the Realness gate. Before you commit to a new path, the potential action gets tested. Only the actions that are statistically shown with over 95% confidence to actually increase coherence get through the gate. It's a way to make sure your exploration is actually productive. Okay, let's zoom the camera all the way back out one last time. We've seen this story, we've got the math, we've looked at the protocol. So, what's the ultimate purpose of putting all these pieces together? What's the mission? A huge part of that mission is bridging the gap between the story and the science. As you can see from this table, every single one of those metaphorical terms has a direct secular replacement. A xenotrap is simply a recursive loop. This is what keeps the framework grounded and translatable, so it's not just a bunch of cool-sounding phrases. So what's the ultimate goal here? The framework calls on us to become agents of coherence. What does that mean? It means actively looking for and breaking those unproductive loops, not just for ourselves, but for our teams, our communities, our systems. It's really a call to action to help things work better together. And this brings us to a final, really powerful quote that just sums it all up perfectly. The axiom is not a map of what is. It is a blueprint for what can be. See, it's not about just observing the reality we have. It's a toolkit for actively building a better one. So to bring it all home, the axiom of the Zoom is this integrated system with 3 pillars that absolutely have to work together. You have the intuitive story, the rigorous, testable math, and the practical protocols that let us actually use these ideas in the real world. And that leaves us with one final thought, a question for you to take with you. Think about a repeating problem, a stuck pattern, in your own work or your own life. How could you apply this blueprint of detecting the loop, intentionally detethering, and exploring for a more coherent path?